I'm seeing lots of familiar names logging in. It's nice to see so many friends. Thank you for joining us this morning. Barbara, is everyone in that's in the lobby? Should I start?
Yes, you can start.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, good morning from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. It's 8 a.m. where I'm joining you from, and I know this is a global event, and we have speakers and colleagues joining us from Berlin, where it's late in the afternoon on Monday. And I know from around the world there are various times that you're joining us. My name is David Legg. I'm a board member of the International Council of Sports Science and Physical Education, ICSPE, and I'm a faculty member at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and have served in a number of Paralympic related volunteer experiences, including a time where I was the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and it is a true honor and sincere privilege to be able to be joined by three esteemed colleagues, and one who is a very in particular probably one of my greatest mentors and influences in my life as far as speakers and go within the Paralympic movement. And so I'll introduce our three speakers momentarily. I will also add that for those of you that are wanting to use closed captioning, it is available through your own system. So you can set it up and have it done through your own system. And you should be able to enable that individually as far as closed captioning goes. As far as the process goes, I'll introduce our three speakers. We do have an hour. I have two questions that I'm going to pose to them. And I know many of you who are attending also sent in questions, and I'm happy to get to those time dependent. But again, we have a hard stop at the top of our hour. So without further ado, the focus of today's session is the Paralympic Games, where it's been and where it's going. And we're just coming off of the 2024 Games in Paris, which were undeniably exciting and successful. And the first question that I'm going to pose is what's been the greatest accomplishment of the Games and the movement? And after I introduce our three speakers, you'll see that they have an opportunity to reflect on quite a history of having attended the Games. Our first speaker, and I'll introduce all three first, and then I'll come back and ask our first speaker to address that first question. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Steadward, who's Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Dr. Steadward was the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee from 1989, and he served in this role from 1989 to 2001. And prior to that, he founded the University of Alberta's Research and Training Center for the Physically Disabled, which is now known as the Steadward Center for Personal and Physical Achievement. He was also the founding president of the Alberta Wheelchair Sport Association and served as the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee from 1984 to 1990. And he was also an IOC member. And perhaps most importantly, he was my PhD supervisor and introduced me to my wife. Our second speaker is Dr. Gudrun Doll-Tepper, who is former president of the International Council of Sports Science and Physical Education. She's professor at Freie University in Berlin, and she's also served as vice president of the German Olympic Sport Confederation and chairperson of the German Olympic Academy, and is the recipient of the International Paralympic Committee's Scientific Award. Our third speaker is P. David Howe, who's a medical anthropology professor at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, and he holds the Dr. Frank J. Hayden Endowed Chair in Sport and Social Impact in the School of Kinesiology there. Dr. Howe was the most recent recipient of the International Paralympic Committee Sports Science or Scientific Award. And as a Paralympian, Dr. Howe competed in para-athletics in Seoul in 1988, Barcelona in 1992, Atlanta in 1996, and in Sydney in 2000. And he earned two medals in those four games, a bronze in the men's cross country event in Seoul in 1988 and a silver in the men's 500-meter race in Barcelona in 1992. So very, very warm welcome to our three speakers. And thank you so much for agreeing to join us this morning and to speak to this topic about the Paralympic Games. So Dr. Steadward, I'll start with you, and then Gudrun and David, I'll go then to the two of you in order. In your opinion, what's the greatest accomplishment of the games and movement since the first games in 1960, and obviously the movement itself having started shortly after World War II? What has been the greatest accomplishment of the games and movement? Dr. Steadward, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Legg, and welcome everyone. It's certainly an esteemed privilege and honor for me to be part of this discussion today. We have to reflect back to years gone by to really understand the important historical implications that history had upon the creation of the International Paralympic Committee, because we must remember that in the early days, they were known as the International Stoke Mandeville Games for the paralyzed. And then it wasn't until the 80s, after Sir Ludwig Guttmann passed away, that we had created another committee, the International Coordinating Committee, that was really providing the leadership for the countries in international sport. But as we all know, there were very few countries who were very satisfied with how it was being managed at the time, because it was not a democratic organization. There was no input from athletes and nations and the like. So one of the biggest aspects for me was when we hosted the Arnhem Seminar in 1987, whereby the countries came together to provide their input on what a new world organization should look like for athletes with a disability, how it should be structured, how it should be governed, and the like. And that really was an unbelievable, significant meeting that was held, because it laid the groundwork for the next year, when we had the first modern Paralympic Games in our history, because they were truly in an Olympic Paralympic cycle and structure then, which then led to the creation of the International Paralympic Committee in 1989. So that Arnhem Seminar was likely one of the greatest impacts on the history of sport that laid the foundation down. But following that, the next significant aspect of our movement was when I was able to negotiate and work with the International Olympic Committee and draw up and sign the very first Memorandum of Understanding, which then allowed us to and required any cities in the future who were planning to bid to host the Olympics also had to include the Paralympics as part of their bid and their organization. So certainly those two elements were crucial to the history and to the success of our games. I mean, there were many, many other significant historical aspects, because they have to understand that we were a mere fledgling caught within the superstructure of international sport. So we were the first 12 years laying down the foundation to what we actually see today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steadward. And yes, I would agree that those two moments are certainly significant. So the Arnhem seminars taking place in 87, the hosting of the Seoul Games in 88, and then the Dusseldorf meetings where the IPC was created in 89, and certainly the finalizing of the contract with the IOC just following the Sydney Games in 2000. I would agree and concur that those are certainly significant moments in the IPC. I would also mention to individuals, please feel free to use the chat. I see many of you are already starting to do that, to introduce both yourselves but also to share any questions or comments as the conversation is taking place. I would encourage you to do that. And I will also acknowledge that we did receive a number of questions in advance. And Dr. Steadward, to your point, some of the questions actually relate to the partnership and relationship with the IOC and where that may move in the future. So time permitting, perhaps we can return to that.
Of
But
course.
Dr. Doll-Tepper, I'd like to move on now to you, please, if I may. And so the same question, what would you say would be the greatest accomplishment so far of the Games and of the movement? Dr. Doll-Tepper, who's joining us this morning from Berlin, by the way, or this afternoon from Berlin, by the way.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm really happy and I'm really excited to be part of this session. Thank you everyone for joining, and particularly thank you David Legg for being our moderator. Of course, I would like to make some additional comments in what Professor Steadward said. I would say that the worldwide recognition of the performance of athletes, the increased media interest, improved visibility of the athletes, and improved training opportunities, I would say that has really progressed over the last decades. Then the Paralympic Games as an outstanding sport event with a remarkable impact on society beyond sport. And I think also what Dr. Steadward just mentioned, the recognition of the IPC by the IOC and the fact that bidding for Olympic Games includes bidding for the Paralympic Games, but also joint organizing committees like we have just had it in Paris, organizers of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And then I would also say the establishment of the IPC headquarters in Bonn, because this also was a very important step towards professionalization, to make it very short. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doll-Tepper. And again, I would concur that the two events, certainly the recognition by the IOC and of the IPC, and that again happened over time with the actual official partnership happening just after the Sydney Games, but also the establishment of the IPC headquarters. Again, I would concur that is certainly a significant moment in the Paralympic history. Dr. Howe, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Dr. Howe is not able to have his video on this morning. Unfortunately, we were having some technology challenges earlier today, but Dr. Howe, if you could share with us a response similar to what we've already heard from Dr. Doll-Tepper and Dr. Steadward. So what, in your opinion, and as a Paralympic athlete, I'm interested to hear your take on this, having competed in 4 Paralympic Games, what would you suggest is the greatest accomplishment of the Games and movement?
Well, the times when I was an athlete are very different and distinct from what they are today. And I think the biggest thing that the Paralympic movement has contributed to society, broadly speaking, is an awareness of diverse abilities. And you know, from early on, when I was an athlete in the mid 1980s to when I retired in the early 2000s, you know, when I started out, there was no understanding of what the Paralympic movement was. And I used to be interviewed by newspapers and television and so on, and the assumption was that I was going to the Special Olympics, which is a wonderful organization, but it's an organization in its own right. And there was no real understanding of what the Paralympic movement is today. And now in 2024, the Paralympic movement has become much more high profile than the Special Olympics movement. And in part, that is a result of the links with the International Olympic Committee that both the previous speakers talked about. But the awareness of abilities and difference of abilities and the fundamental human right for everyone to have the ability to play and be physically active and engage in sport, I think is one of the things that the Paralympic movement has been very good at pushing forward for athletes and those involved in the movement.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Howe. I'm going to come back to the comment because Dr. Steadward made reference to the addition of the varying impairments beyond spinal cord injury, and you also then talked a little bit about, Dr. Howe, you talked about the inclusion of varying or other disability groups. And I want to come back to that perhaps in a later question. But let's move on now to our second question that I shared with the three of you anyways earlier. And that's, what's the greatest challenge for the gains in movement moving forward? So Dr. Steadward, I'll come back to you to start with this, and then we'll go through the same list, and then we'll open it up for more of a conversation. And I would encourage individuals in the chat function, if they wanted to add comments or questions. And again, I'll be trying to use the questions that were submitted earlier for the Q&A from the registration sheet. But Dr. Steadward, over to you. What do you think are the greatest challenges for the games and movement moving forward?
Thank you, Dr. Legg. You know, we have, when you begin to think of 35 years of the modern Paralympic Games since 1989, we have come a long way in a very short period of time in our history. And yet we still have some opportunities and challenges that lie before us. For example, and I can refer to actually a paper that Dr. Howe did, in that I believe we need to do a much better job in ensuring that the public understands what our different classifications are, and we need to continue to review performances to look at continuing to reduce the number of classes and becoming much more stringent on our functional classification. There's no question that that needs to be clearly outlined and educated to our public much better in the future. As well, I think there needs to be a smoother transition from the Olympic competitions into the Paralympic competitions. Because if you've got about a 3-week gap between the two games, people get into a bit of a let's get back to our life, and then all of a sudden they have to gear up. Oh, by the way, the Paralympics are starting in 3 weeks. So they're still in a bit of a hangover from the Olympic Games, and it's tough for people to gear up then again for the Paralympic Games. So we need to find a way, strategic way, through media services to further increase our transition from the Olympic to the Paralympic Games. I think we have a very good control on our drugs situation and the impact of performance enhancements in the Paralympic Games. But we must also, I think, look at more research in the area of technology, because when we look at the cost of some of the equipment that we use, how are the third world countries and the poorer countries going to be able to compete if they don't have the opportunity to have the technology that other countries do? Where do we stand with minimal disability and severe disability? Should we be worrying about that, or are we just going to deal with the best of the best within the structure of our competitions and classification? And lastly, we have come a long way, but I still believe we need to have more research to find ways of including more women in sport, and particularly at the Paralympic Games.
I will point out that you came up with 2 examples when we were talking about the greatest accomplishments, and 6 when we were talking about the greatest challenges moving forward.
Oh,
so there's clearly still lots of work that needs to be done.
yes.
Dr. Doll-Tepper, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to also add to what Dr. Steadward said in terms of classification. I have attended, as you know, many Paralympic Games. In fact, Paris were my 18th Paralympic Games. And still, I think that classification issues have to be solved. I know that maybe it will always be a challenge to really arrange for fair competition. However, I think in particular, since so many IFs now are also involved, that presents, I think, an additional challenge.
Mm.
I also think that there are still enormous differences concerning training opportunities, access to prosthetics, to wheelchairs, that Dr. Steadward also mentioned. How can we ensure that athletes have opportunities to work with professional coaches? And we have to compare the situation not only from a European or North American perspective, but really have to look at the situation worldwide. And how is the situation, for example, in African countries or in South American countries? And so I think despite the fact that we have enormous progress made in terms of the Paralympic Games and Paralympic athletes, I still think that a lot of people with a disability do not have access to participation. And that also is not only happening far away, but it is also happening in our own countries. And so how can we make sure that access is really made available? And how can we strengthen the voices of athletes and take up roles, be working in different areas and also in leadership positions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doll-Tepper. Yeah, so you touched on some of the same ideas that Dr. Steadward mentioned, but you opened up some new and interesting ones that perhaps we can cover later in today's session, particularly the voice of the athletes. But this idea of fairness, I think, is an interesting one. Outside of the Western countries, and opportunities for training, opportunities for coaching, opportunities to access technology, etc. Dr. Howe, over to you. Again, same question. What would you suggest are the greatest challenges facing the games and the movement moving forward?
I think just to reflect on what the other speakers have said, I think one of the difficulties with the Paralympic movement is we expect it to do too much. I don't think it's the role of the International Paralympic Committee or the role of national Paralympic committees to make access to high caliber coaching and so on a priority. That's down to individual governments, individual sports systems within in the context. I think by going in that direction, the Paralympic movement spreads itself too thinly. The biggest issue for me, and David, you won't be surprised about this, is the mirage, or dare I say, the rhetoric that the IPC is using about inclusion. I think it's very, very dangerous that the IPC is selling itself as an inclusive sporting practice, because what it does by saying that Paralympic sport is inclusive sport and so on and so forth, what it does is it devalues the achievements of the athletes. Paralympic sport, since the Dr. Steadward talked about the modern Paralympic Games from 1989 forward, is about high performance sport. And high performance sport is about higher, faster, and stronger. It's exclusionary. Not every athlete that's classified can be part of Paralympic sport. Not all bodies fit. And because it's high performance, not everybody is going to be good enough, technically, physically, to be a Paralympian. And so as performances get better and better, to be trying to sell the movement as inclusive devalues the performances that we're achieving. And I think so the inclusion rhetoric is part of the problem. How do we sell the Paralympic Games? So the IPC, since the opening ceremonies in Tokyo, when they launched the We the 15 movement for the world, about 15% of the world's population having a disability, they've adopted this sort of, we're part of the inclusion movement. But Paralympic sport at the high performance end is not part of that. So the real challenge is, how do we market the Paralympic movement without selling the performances of the athletes short, which is what the push for inclusion is trying to do. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for that comment. It certainly opens up, and you and I have had this conversation back and forth many times, and I would argue that it doesn't necessarily have to be binary in either or, and I think there is room for both, but then again, that's my own personal opinion. I'd like to come back to a comment that was made earlier, and then maybe we'll go to this issue of the games and the movement and its ability to represent the possibility of both high performance sport and possibly inclusion, and whether the two can coexist. But I want to go back to some of the conversations and the comments that were made about kind of the history of the movement and how it started for people with spinal cord injuries. It eventually added other disability groups. And I want to ask the three speakers about your views on the inclusion as this continues to evolve. And so athletes with an intellectual disability, as an example, were included formally in 1992, although there were two separate games, one in Barcelona and one in Madrid. And then in Atlanta was the first time that athletes with intellectual disability competed in the Paralympic Games. They were subsequently banned following the games in Sydney in 2000 and then reinstated in 2012. And in fact, the closing games flag bearer for the Canadian Paralympic team was an athlete that fell under that classification for athletes with an intellectual disability. So that has been a change within the movement. The deaf community was involved when the IPC was first formed, but never formally included in Paralympic Games to the best of my understanding or knowledge either. And you're seeing other, again, impairment groups. And an example would be maybe perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder being included within the Invictus Games, which granted are a different type of games, but are I guess perhaps somewhat similar to a Paralympic Games, and that's sport for returning war veterans. There was a question that was submitted about whether or not epilepsy would be included within a Paralympic context, et cetera. So my question to the three of you is where do you see the evolution of the inclusion of new disabilities, new impairments, or other impairments within the Paralympic movement, and perhaps as both an opportunity and or a challenge? And I'll open that up to any of the three of you if you wish to address that initially. But again, I'm just looking at your thoughts on the history of the inclusion of different impairments, and then also perhaps where this might go in the future.
If I may, I can start. Yes, we all have followed very closely the inclusion of athletes with an intellectual disability, and you just have referred to what has happened in 1992 when we had two parallel Paralympic Games, the one in Barcelona and then Paralympiada in Madrid in Spain. Following then 1996 Atlanta was demonstration events, and 2000 was this kind of scandal with the Spanish basketball team. Since I have been involved in discussing with INAS, which was at that time the umbrella organization, and the IPC in 2007, 8, and 9, and then in 2010 the decision was made that these athletes with ID should return to London 2012. I still find this, and I followed this up, it's still to me a very, very difficult issue. And very often it is mentioned the Paralympic Games are including athletes with physical disabilities and visual impairment, but very, very rarely do we hear anything about ID. Even some countries, and here from Germany, we didn't even send one athlete with ID to the Games in Paris. So I think this is something that still needs to be addressed. And I know this again is a classification issue. However, I think I would really be interested to listen to what colleagues say about the inclusion of athletes with intellectual disability. Very recently, I have been involved also in deaf sport, and I know that there has been discussion in the past, should they join, because in the beginning when Dr. Steadward was elected IPC president in 1989, the International Committee for the Sport of the Deaf joined and then left again in 1995. But I know that in this community, the discussion is still continuing. So I'm also very curious to learn more about your opinions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. Steadward, Dr. Howe, any thoughts on my question as it relates to the inclusion of different impairments?
Well, maybe an answer to this might be a bit easier if we understand what happened to begin with and why. And through my early discussions prior to the creation of the IPC in Düsseldorf, with President Samranch of the IOC at the time, he wanted one world body for athletes living with a disability. He didn't want to deal with 6, 7, or 8 different organizations. So the intellectual disability or disabled, as well as the CIS organization at the time for deaf, had a little bit of involvement in the last couple or 3 years of the ICC. But I mean, ICC didn't even get around to developing any form of a constitution for themselves to govern until about 1986 anyway. But certainly when 89 came about in Düsseldorf, they were both IOSD members of IPC. And I enjoyed immensely having the president of CIS at the time, Gerald Jordan from Gallaudet University in Washington, being part of our board. But he always felt that he was integrated, but he wasn't included. He was part of our board meetings, but he said we'll never be joined under Paralympic Games because we'd be bringing another 5 or 6 or 7,000 athletes, which would be impossible. So after a half a dozen years of IPC, them being part of our movement, and it was an expense because we had to pay the way of a lot of people, plus interpreters and translators for the deaf and hard of hearing. So it wasn't easy. And then the intellectual disability disabled became an issue, more so because of our experience um, leading up to 96 in Atlanta. Because as you know, with Special O being an organization based in the USA, there was very little, if any, cooperation or working relationship with Special O and the organizing committee. So that did create some problems for us in even having a couple of demonstration events for intellectual disabled. And every country is a little bit different with intellectual disability as far as their structure, their integration and inclusion, and the like. It's very different. In fact, when we were investigating the situation after 2000 in Sydney, what had happened is that when we looked at the application to participate, there were psychiatrists, psychologists, school teachers, principals, and parents even signing the forms saying that they're intellectually disabled with absolutely no objectivity to it at all. So it really created an issue for us. And many people feel that that actually kept our organization and our Paralympic movement. It retarded it a little bit, retarded in such a way that prevented it from moving on and improving their aspect in games in with the public.
Thank you, Dr. Steadward. Dr. Howe, any comment on that?
Yes, I think it's something that's been touched on. Rather than thinking about who else can be included in the Paralympic Games in terms of disability specific groups and so on, I think the maintaining the involvement of all the groups that are now part of the Paralympic family is key and important. But the push needs to be about gender equity, parity between the genders, because we're still seeing, you know, one of the sports that was excluded from the last games was CP football, and one of the reasons that was given was that they you know that they it's 7-a-side, so there's lots of players on each team, and there's no room for women to play. Now there are other sports in the Paralympic program, such as blind football, visually impaired football, that are working on a program to get more women involved. There are other sports that are co-ed sports like wheelchair rugby and so on. And you saw in Paris that there were more women on wheelchair rugby than there ever have been previously. But I think that rather than seeing who we can bring to the fold, because we're hamstrung, we're limited in terms of the size of the games because we signed the agreement with the IOC. If I could dial things back, I would talk to a younger version of Bob, and I would say, do not sign with the IOC. It's brought on many positive things, but it also structures what we can do. It shapes how we can change as an organization. It limits the possibility of expanding the games. And so bringing on other disability groups becomes an issue. But I think we need to look and make what's happening within the IPC as it now exists more equitable for everyone. And that includes increasing the number of women, but it also includes increasing the number of athletes with high support needs. And that's not about changing the definition. That's about, people who need carers in daily tasks that have real high support needs need to have more sporting opportunities.
Yeah, and that addresses a question that was submitted from our colleague in Ireland a few minutes ago about whether or not there's been a shift away from focusing on athletes with, in their words, more severe disabilities, and in your definition, high support needs. I think that the gender equity point is certainly well noted and stated. And you mentioned wheelchair rugby, and certainly in a Canadian context, para ice hockey has been a topic as far as having a men's and or women's team, or a co-ed team, and whether or not one is more appropriate than the other. I want to come back to your comment, though, about the agreement with the IOC and the partnership with the IOC, because there were a number of questions that came up from attendees in advance about the partnership and the relationship. One asked if the games, in Los Angeles would be the last, and I know that that's not possible because the agreement goes to 2032 at the earliest, in my recollection, with the games in Brisbane. So, Dr. Howe, you said you would go back and actually perhaps not have signed the agreement with the IOC in the early 2000s, and I think you recognize that there are both pros and cons to a relationship with the IOC. But Dr. Steadward and Dr. Doll-Tepper, I'll pose this to you. The relationship with the IOC, what have been perhaps some of the advantages of working with the IOC and the Olympic Games and the Olympic movement? And where maybe do you see that relationship going forward? And then Dr. Howe, I'll come back to you and ask if you have any further comments as it relates to possibly where the relationship with the IOC may go in the future. So Dr. Doll-Tepper or Dr. Steadward, again, what are your thoughts on the partnership with the IOC, both the pros and the cons, and perhaps where it could go in the future?
Go ahead, Gudrun.
Dr. Steadward, you're first.
Well, when you're in the trenches, on a day-to-day basis, negotiating and working with the International Olympic movement and their structure and how they operate, it was very, very challenging and difficult. I mean, it's not only signing the MOU, but the difficulty we had even celebrating our own logo and how we had to change that because of the pressure from the International Olympic Committee, which came through the British Olympic Committee because of their fear of competition in the marketplace to generate funding and support. So the MOU, I agree with Dr. Howe, is that there were some good things about it and maybe some limitations. But at the time of our history, we needed the profile, we needed the services, we needed the financial support, and the goodwill and their willingness to help us grow as an organization. It would have been impossible for us to grow to where we are today in practical terms if we stayed with the size of staff that I had, which was 4, now 185. And I don't think that we did such a bad job with 4 people running the organization and the movement that they do with 185 today. In fact, we may be better with less, but certainly it was a benefit at the time, and it was in our best interest, because that would have been very difficult for the Paralympic movement to survive to the level at which we are today if we were not part of the Olympic movement. Because I could not see one country who would bid to just host the Paralympic Games, unless we want to go back to the Stoke Mandeville spinal cord injured and hosting our games in rehab centers. It would not work.
Well, if you look at the timing, I mean, in 1984, the games were split, and it really wasn't until the connection in Korea where the modern
That's
Paralympic
correct.
Games, to use your terms, began, and it was just prior to that, and then soon thereafter, that the IPC was formed and the negotiations with the IOC started in earnest. And so, again, if you were to look at the games prior to the relationship with the IOC and the games following the relationship with the IOC, but also, granted, to Dr. Howe's point, in any agreement, in any partnership, there come with certain limitations. But Dr. Doll-Tepper, I'm curious in your thoughts on the relationship, and particularly because of your relationship with the German Olympic Committee and your connection even on a national level, and seeing how those relationships take place again at a national level. But you've also obviously been extremely involved at the international scene as well. So your thoughts on the partnership between the IOC and the IPC?
We talk about the current situation and we talk about the future, but it also reminds me of a strategic planning congress we had in 1995 in Tokyo. And I still remember that being the moderator, or one of the moderators of this conference, the positions that people held at that time were really like 50-50. 50 go with the IOC and 50 said, oh no, don't do it, don't do it. So we know what happened afterwards. And I think when you have to deal with an organization like the IOC, of course, you have kind of to follow certain rules, regulations. It's also about financial support and assistance. And I think there are lots of benefits. However, there are also limitations, and it will be very interesting what will happen in the future. Talking about the situation in Germany, we still have 2 separate organizations, so to speak. We have the German Olympic Sports Confederation, which is the umbrella of sport in Germany and serves as the NOC. And then under that umbrella is a German Paralympic Committee, or German Disability Sport Organization, and they are responsible sending athletes to the Paralympic Games. I know that in other countries, structures have changed, be it in Norway or be it in other parts of the world. However, in Germany, the situation still is like this, which means that the NPC of Germany is with the IPC, and our National Olympic Committee is with the IOC. Of course, there are always negotiations about the future structure, but this is the current fact.
Thank you, Dr. Doll-Tepper. Dr. Howe, any final thoughts before we move on to our next question?
Yeah, I think that some really interesting historical facts from both the other speakers. One of the things I'm mindful of is that when the agreement was signed, the IOC was in a very, very bad position. And their image had been tarnished, the Salt Lake City scandal and so on and so forth. And what better way to look like a good forward-thinking organization than take a bunch of disabled kids and include them as part of your larger movement, okay? So it was politically expedient. But likewise, I think countries are not lining up, and I know, David, this is your research area, countries are not lining up because there's a huge, wonderful, positive legacy for hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games.
There is, that's not true.
And so we're in a situation where very few countries want to host the Olympics. But I bet if we were a separate entity and then we see who wants to host the Paralympics, there would be much more interest. And that's not always for the right reasons, of course, because it's about saying how forward-thinking and liberal we are and all these sorts of things. But I think the IPC, needs to at least talk about, not just say, oh, I hope the IOC renews the contract. They need to actively talk about, is it in our best interest? And can we at least get improved terms in that contract post 2032?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting that we may have signed the document in 2000 in Sydney. And at the time, I was an IOC member, and I was also part of the investigation team with regards to the Salt Lake situation. But signing the agreement was just a piece of paper of formality, because we'd been operating under the terms of that agreement since 1987, 88, and 89, when the situation in Korea was in hosting the games, and then the creation of IPC. So in practicality, we were already operating under that situation, and it just became formalized in 2000. And you're right, Dr. Howe's right in that it may have been a situation where the IOC looked upon it, we need some help here, and the Paralympics and the Paralympic movement and their leaders might be able to prop up our own organization and help us. And if we can help, that's great. But certainly we'd been operating under that situation for 15 years.
We have 10 minutes remaining, and I know that we had broached the idea of discussing, whether or not the Paralympic Games and movement can kind of be both a focus on high performance sport, but also address issues related to accessibility and inclusion. But I've noticed that there are some questions coming in, and there were a number of questions too that was submitted earlier that related to classification. And we've talked a little bit about that, and I would argue that in some respects that is one of the main differentiators between the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, is the classification of athletes with disability, athletes with impairment, for the purposes of trying to ensure somewhat of a fair competition. And we've talked a little bit already today about that transition from the medical model to a more functional one. But moving forward, because we've also recognized that perhaps it's still not perfect. Where do you see it going forward from here? The one comment online was, by addressing it, do you not just create more issues? And perhaps, but how can we, or where do you foresee perhaps the classification system moving forward to provide more equitable opportunities, but also potentially more fair opportunities as well? Do any of the three of you want to address that with the time that we have remaining?
Well, one of the things, Dr. Howe, you brought it up yourself when you started, because I know of your great interest in the whole classification system. And right now we do have a quasi functional classification system for individuals primarily with physical disabilities, and a little bit on the side with intellectual disability. But I'm not concerned so much, but I'm really interested in the direction that the Paralympic movement goes forward in the future with their wonderful strategic plan when it comes to relationships with Invictus and the Invictus Games, because there's many people that compete in the Invictus Games that could be classified for the Paralympic Games, but vice versa wouldn't happen because it's a military situation. And then the other disabilities that are beginning to show in, I mean, an intellectual disability, some of them were autistic. And then you deal with the PTSD, not only from military people, but for non-military people. And David, I think, as you had mentioned, David Legg, about the epilepsy and the like. So I think it's not so much about the functional system that exists, even though I believe that we need to reduce classes further, but it depends on what kind of an organization and movement do we want to have. Do we want to have a sophisticated, limited, high performance, elite sport for a few athletes who look good out there in the track doing the things that they do? Or do we want to be more quote unquote inclusive?
Thank you, Dr. Steadward. Dr. Doll-Tepper, Dr. Howe, any comments on changes to the inclusion system?
David, I would say that there's a tension between what Dr. Steadward says in terms of his desire to reduce the number of classifications and be inclusive, because those two things don't go hand in hand. But a long time ago now, I wrote a paper, and the title of the paper was "The Tail is Wagging the Dog." And I still think, and it was about classification, and I still think that that's the way it goes, that the direction of the Paralympic movement in part will be determined by decisions that are made by classification. And those people that are working in evidence-based classification, I know that there are a couple people from K Leuven on the call. The classification is something that's always moving forward. It's not stagnant. So people that are listening to us, it's ever moving, and the research is going on behind the scenes. I'm more interested in the social aspects of classification, but the biomedical, the biomechanical aspects of classification, people are working really, really hard on this to try and make the system more equitable and fair. And it's not an easy fix.
No, it's clearly not an easy fix. And this is not, by the way, an infomercial for Dr. Howe's article on the tail wagging the dog for special price today only. That's right, $9.99 online. Thank you, Dr. Howe. Dr. Doll-Tepper, any comments on the classification?
How much time do we have?
We have 4 minutes left, and I have seen a number of comments online about asking to extend this. But what I might say is, we could do another session at another time, and we can focus on specific topics if the need is there. I'm certainly more than happy to have more discussions like this online. This has been my absolute pleasure. But Dr. Doll-Tepper, over to you.
Just a few comments. I think you have all followed also the issue of classification with athletes with visual impairment or blindness. Sometimes we are, of course, focusing very much on ID, but I think there are also other issues related to other disabilities. I watched the Invictus Games last year, and there were, of course, many of the athletes having post-traumatic syndrome without having any visible disability. So I think the relationship to Invictus Games is also a very important issue. I think that is something leadership should take up on both sides. And as a former chair of the Sports Science Committee, I would say research is needed more than ever. Thank you.
In fact,
Spoken.
I was going to butt in before Dr. Doll-Tepper did, but I can just emphasize so much, Gudrun, your last point. Research is so very important. We see so much of that happening in the Olympic sports worldwide, but I still don't see the kinds of interest that should be there from the scientific researchers and academics and universities around the world to do more research in the Paralympic movement. And that's a challenge to them. I remember creating the Vista 93, a long time ago now, but that was sort of the seed that was planted and hopefully moving in that direction. And other research scientists around the world, we need to find a way to encourage more academics to get involved in research within sport with athletes living with a disability.
Mm-hmm. Shocking that you have 3 academics all proposing that we do more research in academia as it relates to the Paralympic movement. I will officially close the session. We've got one coming up now on coaching. We've got another potentially on classification. I think we could have a whole other one just on the dichotomy between focusing on inclusion and focusing on high performance. Thank you so much to all of those of you who attended, commented in the chat function, left your comments and questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions and comments that were shared with us. It's been my absolute pleasure to moderate this session with 3 of my very good friends, Dr. Doll-Tepper, Dr. Steadward, Dr. Howe. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for speaking openly and freely. I very much appreciate all of you. Take care, everybody. Happy Monday and happy week.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. Bye-bye.